Today in the bunker, we're going to make cargo pallets suitable for the Wasteland. It's a fairly straightforward build. I'm just going to use some chipboard, which I've cut into 40mm by 40mm squares, but just use whatever size looks right. Bigger or smaller, doesn't matter. Depends on the scale and the kind of minis you're using. Just make something that fits with those. And then I just had these offcuts of insulation foam and cut them into suitable pieces. Some of them neater than others, but that's not a huge problem. If you get that, your knife is dull like mine was, we're going to cover it up and that'll cover a multitude of sins. So just take your square, and I just used PVA, and just arrange the little blocks on here in a way that kind of makes sense for how things would be stacked together. And you can kind of fiddle around with it and put some barrels on there, whatever. We're going to cover that all up with some canvas. So the details won't really matter too much, just you're going for a basic shape. There's a base layer, and again, I just used PVA, put that on there. You might want these a little more kind of squarish than I got them, but that's fine. And you can build these just as is, they sit there, or you could put some rails under this and make like a pallet. Choice is up to you. It depends on what genre or time period you're doing. The pallet as we know it today was invented by the originally invented in the 1930s, but it was perfected and made into what we know as the pallet today by the United States Navy during the Second World War, when they needed a way to efficiently move things into the Pacific. They were hand-nailed back then, if you can imagine that. So just a modern pallet looks a little out of place in other settings sometimes. I saw someone did a diorama of the last days of Berlin, and they had some pallets there, and I'm like, well, one thing that would not have been in Berlin in 1945 is pallets. Most likely. I shouldn't say that entirely because only the Sith deal in absolutes, but whatever. Anyway, once you get the shapes on there the way you like them, and some interesting gaps will allow the canvas to kind of drape in interesting ways, let that dry. And then we'll coat that with some PVA and we'll drape our canvas on there. Strangely, the first one of these I built didn't do it, but these other three that I am in the process of creating started to bow because I glued these to the top. So I applied some glue to the bottom, and that will flatten that back out. So if you have that problem, put a little glue on there, let it dry, and it'll flatten right back out. It's great. Once that bottom dries, it flattens right out. Some of these, like this one, curved a little bit, but not enough that I'm going to worry about it. So if it just bows a little bit, not a big deal. But you can always flatten these out. It's no problem. So what we're going to do is take some PVA, not this, as a cup, PVA, and we're going to mix it with some water. Then we're going to paint that on there. I did this pretty close to half and half, water and PVA, so it's fairly thick, kind of like whipping cream, but it will flow well enough. So let's take an old brush and just apply that all over the faces of all of these blocks so that our canvas will stick to it. And down on the base. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to give it a little bit of something to grab onto. All right, and once you've got that coated on there pretty well, then just take your generic tissue with no printing on it and just lay it down on there. And this is kind of double thick. It's 2 layers of tissue, which is good. And then just start pressing down, and you'll get a lot of folds in the canvas, which is exactly what you want. You want this to have some texture. That'll come out later when we paint it. So get that down on here as best you can and let that dry. Probably you could use one of these tissues to do more than one. That's a little bit, but it ensures that you get it down where it needs to go if you do it that way. Once it starts to set up a little bit, you can go back and start adding some of that white glue and water, PVA water mix to the tissue to get it to kind of lie down the way you want, or you can wait for it to dry and then do it. That's either way is fine. Because it's double layered, it's a little less prone to tear, but use some caution and kind of go gentle on it, and then we'll let that dry and get ready to paint. Once all the tissue and glue has dried, and we're going to take this and prime it. I'm just going to use a rattle can. I'm going to prime it black and then zenithal it with gray. You could use white. You could skip that step entirely. It's completely optional. So it comes out fine no matter what you do. It's just how you want it to look. After priming, they come out and you can see the zenithal kind of makes that pop a little bit. But like I said, it's a completely optional step. So we're going to let these cure for a little bit and then we'll put some color on them. As a base color, I'm just going to use some olive green acrylic paint. You could use any number of colors depending on the time period and genre that these are intended to fit. Most of the canvas that I'm familiar with from being a young lad was left over from, unbelievably, the Second World War. So it was all olive drab. So that's what I think of when I think of canvas. But if you were doing these for more of an earlier period, even into medieval, you would want to paint this kind of an off-white, probably, sort of a linen canvas. That would be appropriate even today in some parts of the world. But you could paint it blue like a tarp or brown or whatever color fits what you're doing on your table. So we'll cut that down. Maybe do it where you can see it. And just mix this up. It doesn't have to be super thick or super thin, just enough so that it flows nicely. And we'll just apply that. And this takes paint very well. It's got a lot of tooth. All right, so we'll just cover all of those and we'll let them dry and go to the next step. All right, our green paint has dried, so I'm going to add a wash, and you can, whatever wash you want to use, a black wash would work. I tend to go towards brown just to get kind of that dirty effect. In this case, I'm going to be using some Army Painter Quick Shade Soft Tone, but you could, literally use whatever wash you want just to darken that up and sort of add a little schmutz to it, make it dirty. And just use kind of a crappy old brush and just add that on, and that will darken it up nicely and start to get down in those low spots. So just cover everything to taste with that, and we'll let that dry, and then we'll go on to the dry brushing. All right, here they are with the wash. We're going to let that dry and cure, and then we will get to the aforementioned dry brushing step. All right, our wash has dried, so we're going to take some, in this case, I'm going to use some sand gray. It's kind of a taupe color. It's more in between kind of tan and gray, but you could use anything in that sort of spectrum that you want to. I've noticed that at least the canvas from when I was a kid, as it aged in war, it got that sort of, not white, but kind of a gray tan color on any of the high spots. So we're just going to dry brush some of that on. And I'm one of those weird people that does that on my hand. You can use paper towel or bog roll, whatever you want to use. And we'll just kind of hit all the high spots and all of the sharp edges. And you can see it has a wonderful texture, which you can smooth out a little more. I like it where it's really wrinkled, because even though it's slightly exaggerated, it kind of helps sell it on the tabletop when it's 3 or 4 feet away from you. And then just do that sort of to taste. Obviously, if you were doing, this was supposed to be like a unbleached linen canvas, this would actually be a good color for that. Put a wash on it and then highlight it with some white. That would look pretty good. I may have to do that. Make some piratey kind of things that are covered up. But just take your time, go over it. And again, it's to taste. You could do it just a little bit if it's fairly fresh, or like these are supposed to be out in the wasteland for a long time, so we're going to make them look pretty faded and crusty. And after dry brushing, here they are, ready to be used as scatter terrain or objective markers. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I hope it inspires you to make something awesome. And I hope you guys have a fantastic day.